You know, when you break a bone, the goal seems pretty straightforward, right? Put it back together and make it as strong as possible. But what if the strongest fix isn't actually the best one? Today, we're going to dive into that very question by looking at one of the most common injuries out there, the ankle fracture. So chances are you, or maybe someone you know, has had an injury that looks a whole lot like this x-ray. It's what's called a distal fibula fracture, basically a break on the outside bone of your ankle. And believe it or not, how surgeons choose to fix this has turned into a really fascinating debate. All right, so first up, let's really get a handle on the problem we're talking about, because this isn't just an injury that happens to athletes, it's a huge issue, especially as our population keeps getting older. Okay, get this. For elderly patients, this is the third most common fracture they'll face, right after the hip and the wrist. It's particularly common among older women, and it's often tied to osteoporosis, which, as you know, is a condition that weakens bones. And this creates a massive challenge for surgeons. I mean, how are you supposed to get screws and plates to hold tight in bone that's already fragile? Well, to try and solve this exact problem of weak bone, modern engineering came to the rescue with a pretty slick, high-tech solution, the modern anatomical locking plate. On paper, it seemed like the perfect answer. So here you can see the two pieces of hardware right next to each other. On the left, you've got the classic, kinda simple tubular plate, and on the right, the modern locking plate. You can see the difference right away. It's more contoured, it's more robust, it just looks way more advanced. But how does it actually work? Okay, the absolute best way to wrap your head around this is with a simple analogy from your own home. A conventional plate? That's like putting a regular screw into drywall. Its hold is only as good as the drywall itself, or in this case, the bone. But a locking plate? That's like using a toggle bolt. The screw head actually locks right into the plate, which creates this single, super rigid structure that doesn't really care how good the bone quality is. And you know what? The biomechanical research totally backed this up. Study after study concluded that for patients with weaker bone, these locking plates were superior, precisely because their stability didn't depend on the bone's density. The theory was rock solid. So to just quickly recap the theory here, the idea was that locking plates would create this super strong, rigid structure that would stop screws from loosening or pulling out of that weak, osteoporotic bone. It really did look like the perfect high-tech solution to a very, very tricky problem. But what about the other guy? The classic alternative, the plate that surgeons had been using for decades before all this new tech came on the scene. Well, for a long, long time, this simple plate, the 1/3 tubular plate, was the absolute workhorse. It was the reliable, go-to standard of care for fixing these ankle fractures for ages. It's a proven, time-tested tool. So this all boils down to two completely different philosophies, right? The classic tubular plates works by compressing the plate against the bone, creating friction. For that to work, the bone quality is absolutely crucial. The locking plate, on the other hand, creates a rigid scaffold. Bone quality is way less of a factor. It was billed as the stronger, better option. And this, right here, is where things get really interesting. This is the core of our entire explainer theory versus reality. Because what happens in a lab and what happens in an actual patient can be two very different things. So what did the clinical evidence show when these two went head-to-head? The question is pretty simple, but the answer has some pretty profound implications. Does all that extra biomechanical strength from the high-tech plate actually lead to better results for the people walking around with it in their ankle? Okay, let's look at the hard data from a 2024 study that did a direct comparison. Right off the bat, you notice that surgeries using the locking plates took a lot longer, about 25 minutes longer. But that's not the jaw dropper. Look at this, the rate of revision surgery. That means having to go back for a second unplanned operation was double in the locking plate group. Over 1 in 5 of those patients had to go back to the OR. I mean, this chart just says it all, doesn't it? Patients who got the supposedly stronger, superior, high-tech plate were twice as likely to need another surgery. This was the complete opposite of what all the biomechanical theories predicted. So what on earth was going on? Well, it turns out there was a hidden trade-off. All that focus on pure mechanical strength had created an unexpected and serious rise in a completely different kind of complication. And honestly, this slide is the key to the entire story. When the researchers dug into why patients needed a second surgery, it wasn't because the plates broke or the screws pulled out, not at all. In fact, more than 94% of the revisions were because of wound complications, problems with the skin and soft tissue healing over the implant. Mechanical failure, the very thing the locking plate was invented to prevent, was almost a non-issue. And just so we're clear, when we say wound complication, we're not talking about a little redness. This can mean a deep, serious infection developing right over the hardware, kind of like what you're seeing here. This can lead to more surgeries, long-term antibiotics. It's just a devastating setback for a patient who is trying to heal and get back on their feet.
The researchers who did this study, they didn't pull any punches in their conclusion. They flat out said their data does not support the general use of locking plates, and this is the big one, that the risk of the hardware failing in these patients, well, that risk seems to be overrated.
So all of this surprising evidence has really led to a whole new perspective on what it actually takes to heal a broken bone.
And look, this wasn't just a fluke in one study. A huge meta-analysis that pooled data from almost 3,000 patients found the exact same thing. First, there was no difference in the outcomes that matter most, like whether the bone healed or how well the ankle worked later. Second, it confirmed a significantly lower risk of wound problems with the older, simpler tubular plates. And the most likely reason? The thicker, bulkier locking plates probably just put too much pressure on the delicate skin over the ankle.
So, the big takeaway here? It's that we're seeing a major shift in how surgeons think about this. The priority seems to be moving away from just creating the strongest possible fix at all costs and more toward prioritizing the health of the soft tissues around the bone. Because at the end of the day, a bone can't heal if the environment around it is falling apart. And that really leaves us with a big final question, one that goes way beyond just fixing ankles. In our constant quest for stronger, better, more high-tech solutions, we always have to stop and ask, in the pursuit of perfect stability, what are we actually willing to risk?